When I lifted the lid of the cedar chest in my study and found it empty, my stomach dropped before my mind could even form the question. That chest had sat in the corner of this room for 11 years, ever since Margaret passed, and it had held one thing and one thing only, her father's war diary, 43 years of marriage, and that diary was the last piece of her I had left. My son Thomas was standing in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching me the way you watch someone you've already written off. The chest was cluttering up the study, he said. Carolyn needed space for her pottery wheel. I put the stuff out at the garage sale last Saturday. I turned to face him slowly. You put it out. It was just an old notebook, Dad. Nobody even bought it. The sale guy took the leftover boxes to that antique place on Dundas Street. You know, Hartwell's. Just an old notebook. My father-in-law had carried that diary from Normandy to the Rhine. Margaret had read it to me in bed on our first winter together in this house, her voice dropping to a whisper at the parts that made her cry. She'd kept it wrapped in a piece of her grandmother's quilt inside that chest, and Thomas had put it out on a folding table in the driveway with a $5 sticker on it. When? I asked. Last Saturday. Like I said, I didn't wait for more. I was already pulling my jacket off the hook by the door. I should tell you who I am before I go further, because what happened next will seem strange unless you understand the kind of man Margaret married. My name is Gerald Holt. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a land surveyor working out of London, Ontario, which means I have spent most of my adult life making sure measurements are exact and records are permanent. I do not lose things. I do not accept that things are simply gone. Margaret knew that about me. She married me because of it, and sometimes in spite of it. Hartwell's Antiques sits on Dundas Street in a narrow Victorian storefront that smells like cedar and old paper, which on that particular Tuesday morning nearly broke me in half before I even got through the door. A woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair, was arranging a display of depression glass bowls near the window. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. I described the diary. Leather cover, dark brown, cracked along the spine, approximately 200 pages. The name Arthur Fenwick written inside the front cover in blue fountain pen. She set down the bowl she was holding. We did get a box in from a garage sale last weekend. Haven't gone through all of it yet. She studied my face. Give me a moment. She disappeared into the back. I stood among the grandfather clocks and pressed glass decanters and tried to breathe normally. When she returned, she was carrying a cardboard box, and she set it on the counter between us and began lifting things out carefully. A set of silver spoons, a hand-painted tin, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, and then the diary. The leather was worn dark at the corners where Arthur Fenwick's hands had gripped it during the winter of 1944. I recognized it the way you recognize a person's face in a crowd, without having to think. That's it, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. She held it gently, turned it over once, then opened the front cover. Read something. Looked up at me. There's an inscription here, she said carefully. On the inside front cover, it says, For Gerald, when you need to remember what we fight for. The coordinates are in Chapter 7. All my love, M. I felt the room tilt slightly. Margaret had been gone for 11 years. She had written my name in her father's diary, and I had never known. How much? I asked. She closed the diary slowly and looked at me for a long moment. Take it, she said. Just take it. I should explain who was living in my house before I tell you what I found in Chapter 7, because none of what happened afterward makes sense without that context. Thomas was 41. He'd moved back in 3 years ago after his second business failed, this one a craft brewery in Kitchener that had lasted 14 months. He brought Carolyn with him, his girlfriend of 6 years, and her teenage son Ethan from a previous relationship. Temporary, Thomas had said. Just until we get sorted. I'd believed him because he was my son and because Margaret had always said we had to give him room to find his footing, that some people just needed more time. 3 years later, they had taken over the main floor. Carolyn had converted Margaret's old sewing room into a pottery studio. Thomas had turned the garage into a home gym. Ethan, who was now 17, had claimed the spare room and covered the walls in band posters over the wallpaper Margaret and I had chosen together in 1998. Nobody paid rent, nobody paid utilities. The grocery bills that came out of my account had roughly doubled. Every time I raised the subject of a timeline, Thomas said they were close, just a few more months. and Carolyn would make a comment about how family doesn't charge family, which was an interesting position from someone who wasn't technically my family. I drove home from Hartwell's with the diary in the passenger seat, and a feeling I couldn't quite name yet sitting behind my sternum. Thomas and Carolyn were both out. Ethan was somewhere in the house with headphones on. I went to my study, closed the door, sat down at my desk, and opened the diary to Chapter 7. Arthur Fenwick had a surveyor's instinct for precision, which may be why his daughter had fallen in love with one. His diary entries were dated, organized, specific. Chapter 7 covered January and February of 1945, the push through Belgium. The prose was spare and careful, the handwriting of a man who chose words deliberately. On the third page of Chapter 7, the entries stopped mid-paragraph. The rest of the page was blank. And then, in Margaret's handwriting, unmistakably hers, a paragraph that had not been there 40 years ago when she first read this diary to me. Gerald, if you're reading this, something happened to me before I could tell you in person. I started writing this the year I was diagnosed. I didn't tell you about the second prognosis because I knew you would spend whatever time I had left trying to fix it instead of living it with me. I made a choice. I hope you can forgive me for it. There is a safety deposit box at CIBC on Richmond Street, box 318. Your name is on it. I added you in 2009 and I never told you because I hoped you'd never need it. But if you're reading this note, it means Thomas found the diary before you did, or someone moved it, or I ran out of time to tell you myself. The box number is in my father's first entry, the date he shipped out. Look at the numbers. I sat very still. I turned to the first entry in the diary. The 3rd of July, 1943. Arthur Fenwick, serial number 318F7742, reporting for embarkation at Halifax, Nova Scotia. 3:18. Margaret had been a woman who thought 11 moves ahead. We had spent 43 years playing chess together on Sunday mornings, and she had beaten me so consistently that I'd eventually just accepted it as the nature of things. She had hidden a message for me inside her father's war diary, inside a serial number on the first page, and she had trusted that if I ever needed to find it, I would think to look. I sat there in my study with my hands flat on the desk for a long time. Then I put on my coat and drove to the CIBC on Richmond Street. The branch manager was a man named Vincent Osei, calm and professional, who listened without visible skepticism as I explained the situation. I had the diary. I had my ID. I had Margaret's death certificate in the glove compartment of my truck, where I had kept it for 11 years because removing it had felt like a finality I wasn't ready for. Vincent returned from the vault room with a long metal box and set me up in a private room with a glass of water and the particular careful courtesy that people offer you when they sense something significant is about to happen. The box was heavier than I expected. Inside, an envelope with my name on it in Margaret's handwriting. A USB drive, the kind she had always called a memory stick in that way that made me smile. And beneath both of those, bundled in elastic bands, a quantity of Canadian savings bonds and bank documents I didn't stop to count yet. I opened the letter. My darling Gerald, by now you've found this through a path I tried to make as clear as possible. I hope it wasn't too difficult. I hope Thomas didn't make it too difficult, though I suspect if you're reading this in a bank rather than in our study, he probably did. I say that with love for our son, but also with clear eyes. I've had clear eyes about Thomas for a long time, even when I couldn't say so out loud because I knew it would hurt you. Here is what I know. Thomas is not malicious. He is just someone who has always believed that the world owes him a soft landing, and the people who love him most have always provided one. We are not exempt from this, Gerald. We made him this way, partly. I take my share of that, but I also know that after I'm gone, he will move back in. He will bring whoever he's with at the time. They will stay. They will slowly replace everything I left behind with their own things. Not out of cruelty, but out of the particular thoughtlessness of people who don't notice what they're standing on. My sewing room will become something else. My father's diary will end up in a garage sale. I hope I'm wrong about that last part. What's in this box is mine, Gerald. Not ours. Not the family's mine. The money from my mother's estate that I never spent. The bonds I bought with 30 years of birthday money and Christmas money, and the overtime I worked the last 5 years before retirement because I knew what I was saving for, even before I knew I'd need to save it. Approximately $62,000. This is not for the house expenses. It is not for Thomas's next venture. It is for you to have a life after this one ends. I want you to sell the house. I want you to find somewhere smaller and quieter and completely yours. I want you to wake up in the morning without anyone else's dishes in your sink. The USB has a video. Watch it when you're alone. And when you need to hear me tell you directly, you have done enough. You have been enough. Let yourself be free. All my love, always, Margaret. I didn't cry in the bank. I drove home first, parked on the street because Thomas's truck was blocking the driveway again, and I sat in my vehicle in front of my own house for 15 minutes before I went inside. Carolyn was in the kitchen. Thomas came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "Where'd you go?" he asked. "Bank." He glanced at the diary under my arm. "You found it then. Good. See? I told you it hadn't gone far. You put your grandfather's war diary in a garage sale," I said quietly. "It was in a box, Dad. I didn't specifically— Don't." I kept my voice level. "Don't explain it right now." I went to my study and closed the door. I plugged in the USB and opened the only file on it. Margaret was sitting in the chair by the window in our bedroom. She must have filmed it on a Sunday, because the light was the way it gets on Sunday mornings in that room, soft and slightly golden. She was thinner than I remembered from the good years, but her posture was the same, straight, composed, the posture of a woman who had decided something. "Gerald," she said. "Hello, love." I pressed my hand over my mouth. "I know you're angry with me for not telling you about the box," she said. "You can be angry. You've earned the right to be angry at me for at least a few things over 43 years, and I'll accept this as one of them. But I need you to listen." She leaned forward slightly, the way she always did when she wanted to make sure I was paying attention. "You have spent your entire life making sure the measurements are right, making sure everything is exact and documented and in its proper place. That is the thing I have loved most about you, and also the thing that will keep you trapped in that house long after you should have left it, because you will keep trying to measure your way to a solution that doesn't have one. Thomas is not a problem you can survey. He will not become the right shape if you keep adjusting the boundaries. He is who he is, and you deserve to live in a house that is actually yours." She paused. "Sell the house, Gerald. Buy something small. Go somewhere you've always wanted to go and haven't, because there was always something else more urgent. Call Brian Morrison, because I know you haven't talked to him in 2 years, and he's your oldest friend, and you've been avoiding him because you're embarrassed about the situation with Thomas, and you shouldn't be. None of this is your fault." She smiled at me. That specific smile. The one she'd given me across the table at a faculty Christmas party in 1979, when I'd said something that made her decide she wanted to know me better. "You found my father's diary," she said. "Good. Now go find yourself." The video ended. I sat in the dark study for a long time. Outside, I could hear Thomas in the kitchen, the refrigerator opening and closing, Ethan's music faintly through the ceiling. Then I opened my laptop and wrote down everything I was going to do next. I started documenting the same way I documented survey work: dates, observations, evidence. November 14th, Thomas blocked driveway for the 3rd time that week. Photographed. November 17th, discovered Carolyn had added herself to my Costco membership using my card without asking. Confirmed by charge on my statement. November 19th, Thomas informed me the basement workshop, my workshop, where I still had a lathe I'd owned since 1987, would need to be temporarily cleared out so Ethan could use it as a practice space. November 22nd, overheard Carolyn telling Thomas on the phone that if they could just get me to add Thomas to the mortgage, they'd have options. November 23rd, Thomas asked me, casually, over breakfast, whether I'd ever thought about putting the house in both our names. "For tax purposes," he said. "Just something to think about." I called a lawyer named Patricia Drummond at a firm on Wellington Street. She had been recommended to me by a colleague from my surveying days, a woman who had once described her as someone who did not waste words. This turned out to be accurate. "Walk me through the living situation," she said. So I did. Under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, she said, "When I finished, your son and his partner are tenants. No written lease, no rent paid, doesn't matter. 3 years of occupation establishes tenancy. You need to follow proper process. How long does that take? 60 days notice. If they contest, it goes to the landlord and tenant board. That can add 2 to 4 months." She paused. But there are circumstances that expedite. If you have evidence of financial abuse or threats, we move faster. I have documentation, I said. Photographs, account statements, a recorded conversation. She was quiet for a moment. You moved quickly. I'm a surveyor, I said. I document things. Good, she said. Then let's begin. I signed the retainer on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia filed the formal notice to vacate the following Monday. A process server arrived at my house on Wednesday morning at 8:15, professional and businesslike, and handed Thomas the document while he stood in the front hallway in his socks. I watched from the kitchen doorway. Thomas read it. His face went through several stages: confusion, disbelief, and then a cold fury I hadn't seen since he was 17 and I'd told him he couldn't take the car. You're evicting us, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm asking you to find your own home. You've had 3 years. Mom would never. Don't. My voice was steady. Don't tell me what your mother would do. Your mother left me a letter, Thomas. She knew exactly what would happen. She knew before she died. He stared at me. What letter? That's not something you need to know right now. Carolyn appeared at the top of the stairs. When she came down and read the notice over Thomas's shoulder, she turned to me with an expression I can only describe as managerial. Robert, she caught herself. Gerald, this is completely unnecessary. We can work something out. We can start paying something toward the bills, The notice has been served, I said. Speak to Patricia Drummond at Wellington Legal if you have questions. I went to my study and closed the door. The next 6 weeks were difficult in the specific way that living with people who are angry at you is difficult. The studied silences, the pointed comments, the performance of misery designed to produce guilt in an audience of one. Ethan started leaving his dishes in the sink, directly in front of mine, as though proximity might communicate something. Carolyn began making remarks about the cold, about the house being kept too warm, about the cost of things, in a tone that was meant to remind me that I was the unreasonable party. I installed a small security camera in the living room and kitchen. I am not proud of this, but Patricia had told me to document anything that might be relevant, and I had learned from Margaret's example that you protect the things that matter. December 11th, 6:47 p.m. Thomas, on the phone. He won't follow through. He never follows through. We just have to wait him out. December 15th, 9:12 p.m. Carolyn to Thomas. In the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. We should get him assessed. My cousin went through this with her dad. If you can show some cognitive decline, you get power of attorney. And then I stopped the recording there. Sent the clip to Patricia that night. Her response came at 7 the next morning. File for emergency protection order immediately. I'll handle it. The hearing was 3 days before Christmas. I sat across from a judge in a small courtroom on Dundas Street and watched her review the video. She granted the protection order. Thomas was served the same afternoon. I spent Christmas Day alone in my study, listening to my family celebrate in the living room, and I watched Margaret's video again and ate the shortbread I had made from her mother's recipe, which I had written out from memory because I had watched her make it every December for 43 years. Be selfish, she had said. Live your life. The landlord and tenant board hearing was scheduled for late January. Thomas's lawyer, a man named Gill who had the energy of someone billing by the minute, attempted to negotiate 3 times before the date arrived. Each time Patricia said the same thing: vacate by the agreed date, or we proceed. On January 28th, the adjudicator reviewed the documentation, reviewed the protection order, reviewed 3 years of financial records, showing 0 contribution to a household where 3 adults and a teenager had been living rent-free. She granted the eviction. Thomas had until February 28th to vacate. He came to my study door that evening. I hope you understand what you've done, he said. I've asked you to live in a home that belongs to you, I said. That's what I've done. Ethan has nowhere. Ethan is Carolyn's son, I said gently. That has always been Carolyn's responsibility to manage. I hope she manages it well. Thomas looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen in years. Something younger and less hardened. Then it was gone. Mom's letter, he said. What did she say? About me. I thought about Margaret in that chair by the window, her voice steady and clear, telling me the truth about our son with love and sorrow and no illusions. She said you weren't malicious, I told him. She said you were someone who always expected a soft landing. She said we helped make you that way. I paused. She loved you, Thomas, without conditions. But she also saw you clearly. He left without responding. I heard his door close down the hall. They were gone by February 25th, 3 days before the deadline. I watched the moving truck pull away from my upstairs window, and I felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a difficult position for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. The house was quiet. I walked through every room. Carolyn's pottery kiln had left a scorch mark on the floor of Margaret's sewing room. There was a hole in the drywall in the basement where something had been moved carelessly. Ethan's room needed repainting. I made a list. I took photographs. Patricia filed for damages. Then I called a realtor named Diane Beaumont, who had a reputation in London for selling homes quickly to the right people. She came on a Thursday, walked through every room with her arms crossed and her eyes moving steadily over everything. "Beautiful bones," she said. "Original trim. Is that the original hardwood?" "Most of it," I said. "What are you asking?" "Whatever it's worth. I'm not negotiating against myself." She looked at me appraisingly. "Good. I like clients who know what they want." The house listed at $689,000. 2 offers came in the first weekend. I accepted the better one. A family with 3 children who wanted to move in before the school year ended. They stood in the front hallway with their kids running through the empty rooms, and I watched their faces and thought, yes, this is right. I had already found my next place. Owen Sound sits on Georgian Bay, 2 hours north of London, and Margaret and I had driven up there every few years, just to walk along the escarpment and eat fish and chips at a place on the waterfront that had been there since the 1960s. We had talked about retiring there. We had talked about a lot of things. I went back alone in March, driving the same route we'd always taken, and I found a 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street 3 blocks from the water, with a proper workshop-ready garage and a back garden that got good morning light. I put in an offer using Margaret's money for the down payment. The seller accepted. I moved on the 1st of April, which Margaret would have found appropriate and funny. I kept almost nothing from the old house, Margaret's desk, her father's diary in its place of honor on my study shelf, my tools, our photographs. Everything else I sold or donated or left behind. The new house smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I stood in the empty kitchen on the first evening and opened all the windows and listened to the sound of the bay 3 blocks away and thought, this is mine. I set up my workshop in the garage that first week. Lathe against the east wall, where the light came in. Workbench under the window, tools hung in order the way I had always kept them. First project, a proper display stand for Arthur Fenwick's diary. Oak, hand-joined, with a small brass plate engraved with his name and his dates. I called Brian Morrison on a Tuesday morning in April. He picked up on the second ring. "Gerald Bloody Holt," he said. I was starting to wonder. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry it took this long." "What happened?" "A lot," I said. "I'll tell you over a beer. Are you free this weekend?" He drove up from Guelph on a Saturday. We sat on my back porch, and I told him everything, from the empty cedar chest to the garage sale, to Margaret's diary, to the note in Chapter 7. He listened the way old friends listen, without interrupting, without offering solutions, just listening. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She always was the smartest person in any room," he said. "Yes," I said. "She was." That summer, I joined a woodworking co-op that met in a space above a hardware store downtown. 8 or 9 of us, mostly retired, various skill levels, various levels of willingness to admit what we didn't know. I fit in immediately. We made things. We drank coffee. We argued about joinery techniques with the specific passion of people who had found the thing they actually wanted to be doing. Thomas called in September. I had been watching the news with my dinner when the phone lit up with his name, and I sat with it in my hand for a moment before I answered. "Dad." His voice was different, quieter. "Tomas. Carolyn and I were not together anymore. She left in August. Took Ethan." A pause. "I've been staying with a friend. I got a job. Warehouse work. It's not." He stopped. "I wanted to tell you I've been thinking about what you said. About Mom seeing me clearly." "All right," I said. "I read Grandpa Fenwick's diary. Years ago. Mom used to let me read parts of it." His voice shifted. "I didn't know she'd written in it. I didn't know what it meant, what I was putting in that box." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Thomas had never been malicious. Margaret had said so. The carelessness was real, but the malice wasn't. Can we? He stopped. I'm not asking to move back in or anything like that. I know that's done. Can we try to talk sometime? I looked out my window at the back garden, at the oak tree that had already started to turn at the edges, gold and rust against the gray September sky. Yes, I said. We can try. But Thomas, slowly. Do you understand? Slowly and honestly. Yeah, he said. Okay. Slowly. I hung up and sat with the evening for a while. No triumph, no particular relief. Just the quiet particular to a man who has made a decision he can live with. I went out to the workshop after dinner and spent an hour on a jewelry box I was making for Brian's wife's birthday. Cherry wood, hand-cut dovetails, a fitted interior of green velvet. Precise work. The kind of work that asked for all of your attention and gave you something exact and true in return. The bay was visible from my workshop window if I stood at the right angle. On clear evenings, the water caught the last of the light and held it. I thought about Margaret in that bedroom chair, thin and composed, making her careful plans, planting her message in her father's words, trusting me to find it. She had always said I was too precise for my own good, that I surveyed everything instead of just living in it. But she had also, in the end, trusted that precision to carry her message home. I finished the dovetail joint I was working on and held it up to the light. Clean, exact, the way good work looks when you've taken the time to get it right. Margaret had taught me most of what I knew about that. I set the piece down and looked at Arthur Fenwick's diary on the shelf across the room, between the photographs. We fight for this, he had written in January of 1945, somewhere in the cold dark of Belgium. Not the land, the people in it, the ones waiting at home. You keep the people, and the rest can be rebuilt. I had kept the people, the ones worth keeping, and I had rebuilt the rest. Before I close this story, I want to say something to anyone who recognizes themselves in it, anyone who has let love become a reason to accept less than they deserve. Margaret was wiser than me. She understood something I had to learn the hard way, that protecting someone from consequences is not the same as loving them. We can love our children completely and still refuse to disappear into their needs. We can honor the people we've lost without allowing what they left behind to be taken from us. The boundaries we set are not walls against our families. They are the foundations that make genuine relationship possible, and it is never too late to build them. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every one, and if you want to hear the next story, it's waiting for you right there on your screen.